Retired Supreme Court Justice Louise Arbour has released a scathing report on the Canadian Armed Forces' resistance to change. This despite decades of scandals, criticism, and broken promises. She makes 48 recommendations, saying it's long past time for the military to scrap traditions and structures that perpetuate a sexualized culture. Madame Arbour says some of the military's members are more at risk of harm from their comrades on a day-to-day basis than they are from the enemy, and that this must change. Well, joining us now to give us a deeper understanding of sexual misconduct within the Canadian military is MacKenzie, Professor of International Law and Human Security at Fraser University, an expert in military culture. Professor MacKenzie, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, almost a quarter of women serving in the military have said they'd been sexually assaulted during their careers. So what is fueling this toxic and dangerous culture in the military?
Well, I think it's been decades of a lack of accountability. We have had very low conviction rates when it comes to sexual misconduct and sexual assault. And so you have an environment where perpetrators feel emboldened. They feel like they're going to get away with it. And for many decades, they have, including senior leaders.
And what do we know so far about how this culture impacts male CAF members in the long run, even after leaving the military?
So we know that it affects all members, male and female. We know that half of the victims that came forward in the class action lawsuit were men. This is not an issue that only affects women. So it's a toxic environment for male service members and female service members.
And out of these 48 recommendations in this report, which ones stand out to you as the most impactful?
I think the two that stand out to me, the first one is that she's recommending all criminal sexual misconduct cases be handled in the civilian courts and continue to be handled in the civilian courts. That was an interim recommendation she made about a year ago. And for that to be made permanent is very significant. She's essentially saying the military justice system has not handled these cases properly or well. And that's a major recommendation. The second major one, I think, relates to the military colleges and her call for an extensive review on whether the colleges are useful anymore and the toxic environment of those colleges.
And staying on the point of these military colleges, there are dedicated colleges in Ontario and Quebec, and according to the report, they carry a reputation for perpetuating a sexualized culture. Now, these are officers that are being groomed to enter the military. So what do we know so far about this particular issue in and of itself?
Well, we know that the two military colleges, as the report says, have a history of a sexualized culture. There's a history of service members being assaulted in those colleges. We also know that the colleges are not very representative of Canadian society. Most of the students, the vast majority, are white men from Ontario and Quebec. So one of the recommendations she makes is to consider whether or not service members would be better suited to be integrated into normal, regular universities rather than isolated in a sort of hyper-masculine context.
Now, unfortunately, advocates have been calling for change in the military for years, and there have been similar reports out. So historically, how has the government responded to such calls?
Historically, the government has not responded well. There's been sort of blips of action, lots of commitments, lots of rhetoric, lots of statements like zero tolerance. And then often the majority of recommendations sit on the shelf and gather dust, quite frankly. And so I think what we heard yesterday is the Minister of Defense make a commitment that these recommendations won't sit on the shelf as others have. But I think only time will tell, to be honest.
All right, Professor MacKenzie, about a minute left here. But what are you keeping your eyes on as the government continues to react to this report?
Well, I'm really looking to see, we had a commitment to implementing 17 of the 48 recommendations. Some of those 17 are very sort of low bar, easy recommendations. I'm really looking to see how the review of the military colleges is going to go and what is the commitment on the remainder of those 48 recommendations and what the timeline is going to look like for implementing those recommendations.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Professor MacKenzie, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
Stay with us. After the break, we'll take a look at news from around the world. Ukraine's president says 22 million tons of wheat are being blockaded by Russia. European Union leaders agreed to cut Russian oil imports, and Shanghai moves toward ending its 2-month COVID-19 lockdown on Wednesday. We'll have more on these stories and other news stories from around the world up next on Forum Daily, so stay tuned. We'll be right back after the break. In the meantime, you could always check out our website, thenewsforum.ca, or follow us on our social media handles for updates. We're available on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All right, stay tuned. We'll be right back very shortly on Forum Daily.